In 1944, along the fractured hedgerows of the European front, the war narrowed to a single breath held between heartbeats. A German sniper lay motionless in the cold earth, his rifle settled into the crook of his shoulder as if it belonged there. He was feared not because of who he was, but because of what he could do. From concealment at distances measured and rehearsed, he had ended lives without ever hearing their voices. Precision had become his shelter, detachment his armor. Snipers were not sent to win territory. They were sent to remove certainty. Officers fell, runners never arrived. A moment's exposure could mean the end of command or the collapse of momentum. This marksman understood the logic. Each target was a calculation, not a person. On this morning, his orders were simple. An American soldier had been spotted moving with confidence across a familiar route. The rifle was zeroed. The wind was red. The distance was known. What the sniper could not measure was irony. War teaches men to reduce the world to lines and angles, but it cannot control the paths those lines eventually cross. Somewhere beyond his scope, the American soldier was performing his own ritual of survival, counting steps, memorizing cover, trusting in habits learned too late and tested too often. Two men, trained to remain unseen, were being drawn toward the same narrow strip of ground. The struggle that followed was not explosive. It was silent and prolonged. Hours passed, muscles cramped. Insects crawled across exposed skin. Each man waited for the other to make the smallest mistake. In this patient duel, the battlefield seemed to pause as if aware that a decision was being weighed. And yet this was not a story destined to end where most sniper stories do. The war would move. Front lines would break and reform. Captivity would replace concealment. In the months that followed, circumstance, not mercy, would place these two enemies in proximity, stripped of rifles and reduced to names, accents, and shared exhaustion. What began as a mission to eliminate a target was already bending toward something else, something no scope could predict. Because when the shooting stopped, the war would demand a different kind of reckoning, one that neither man had trained for and neither could refuse. By the middle years of the war, the German sniper had become a specialist shaped by repetition. His expertise was not inherited or romanticized. It was earned through long hours of instruction, fieldcraft refined under fire, and the ruthless arithmetic of survival. He understood ballistics as instinct, terrain as language. Each engagement sharpened his efficiency. Each success reinforced the belief that precision, properly applied, could bend chaos into order. Among American units, his presence was spoken of in lowered voices. Men altered routines, avoided open ground, delayed movement until fog or darkness provided cover. The distances attributed to his shots grew longer with each retelling, but the effect was real. A single unseen rifle had slowed entire formations. Fear, once introduced, proved more disruptive than any artillery barrage. The sniper became less a man than a rumor, an invisible threat that shaped behavior long before the trigger was pulled. Yet reputation does not insulate the conscience. Away from the scope, the weight of accumulated moments began to surface. Faces blurred together. The distinction between necessary and excessive grew harder to define. The war that had once seemed orderly, even purposeful, now revealed itself as endless repetition without resolution. Each confirmed kill answered no questions. It only demanded the next one. This was the struggle the training manuals never addressed. In still moments between deployments, the sniper confronted the erosion of meaning. Skill had brought survival, but not clarity. The discipline that once sustained him now felt like a narrowing corridor, leading only forward and offering no exit. He remained effective, but something essential had shifted. Precision no longer brought pride, it brought silence. Unaware of this internal reckoning, command issued another assignment. Another American, another set of coordinates. On paper, nothing distinguished this mission from dozens before it. But war has a way of disguising turning points as routine. The man assigned to his sights carried his own burdens, his own history, and his own reasons for being there. The rifle would soon be raised again. The distance would be measured. But the next encounter would not end where doctrine predicted. Somewhere beyond the crosshairs, a shared future was already forming, one neither soldier could yet imagine, and neither could prevent. For the American infantryman, danger was no longer an event. It was a condition. By 1944, the knowledge that unseen eyes watched every hedgerow and shattered wall had become as routine as checking his rifle or tightening his helmet strap. Snipers did not announce thems. Elves, they erased men between steps. Survival depended not on courage alone, but on the discipline to assume that death was always nearby. Experience had taught him methods that were never written down. He varied his routes. He learned to read unnatural stillness. He moved when others moved, stopped when the air felt wrong. These habits were not signs of fear, but of adaptation. The battlefield rewarded those who treated every open space as a question rather than an invitation. He had learned this lesson early, and it had kept him alive while others fell. What he could not know was the unseen hesitation on the other end of the field. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the German sniper studied his movement with practiced familiarity. Yet the shot that doctrine demanded did not come. The American remained unaware that his continued existence owed less to luck than to an internal struggle unfolding far beyond his senses. Still, fear exerted its pressure. Each assignment carried the same unspoken calculation: move too slowly and risk the mission, move too quickly and risk the bullet. Letters from home spoke of ordinary life continuing without him, a reminder of what survival was meant to protect. He held onto routine because routine created purpose, and purpose held fear at bay. The war reduced men to roles: shooter and target, hunter and hunted, but those roles were beginning to blur. The American infantryman advanced through terrain shaped by choices made long before he arrived, unaware that his presence had already unsettled the man trained to end it. The duel between them was real, but its outcome no longer followed the logic of the battlefield. Neither soldier could see the larger design taking shape. One waited for a shot that never came. The other waited for a reason to fire that no longer held. Between them stretched a silence heavy with consequence. And as the front shifted and circumstances intervened, that silence would soon be broken, not by gunfire, but by an encounter that would redefine what it meant to be an enemy. The German sniper settled into position with the familiarity of ritual. The rifle was steady. The scope framed the world into clean, manageable lines. Distance, wind, elevation, everything aligned as it had countless times before. Through the glass, the American soldier appeared briefly between cover, unaware that the moment had already been calculated. This was how wars were reduced to seconds. This was how decisions were executed without conversation. The trigger broke cleanly, but fate, indifferent to preparation, intervened. The shot did not end where it was meant to. A fraction of movement, a step delayed, a posture shifted, altered the outcome. The bullet struck earth instead of flesh, passing close enough to announce itself but not close enough to kill. The American dove for cover as instinct overtook thought, heart racing not from pain, but from survival granted without explanation. For both men, the moment lingered longer than the sound of the shot. The American lay pressed into the soil, aware that he had been spared by margins too small to trust. He did not know why he was alive, only that he was. The field that had seemed passable moments earlier was now transformed into hostile space, every shadow suspect, every pause weighted with threat. Across the distance, the sniper remained still. A miss was rare. A near miss carried its own consequences. He replayed the instant with professional reflex, searching for error, yet the mechanics offered no comfort. The shot had been sound, the conditions correct. What unsettled him was not failure of skill, but the sensation that something essential had slipped beyond calculation. This hesitation marked a quiet fracture. The war had trained him to correct and fire again. Doctrine demanded persistence, but the impulse stalled. The American was no longer an abstract target. He was a man who had just lived. The silence that followed pressed harder than recoil. Precision, once reliable, now felt fragile. For the American soldier, the encounter became a warning etched into muscle memory. He moved differently afterward, lower, faster, more alert. Survival sharpened his focus but deepened his unease. The enemy was out there, unseen, disciplined, patient. The danger had not passed, it had only announced itself. Neither man understood the full weight of what had just occurred. On paper, nothing had changed. No casualty was recorded, no report filed, yet the failed shot unsettled both sides of the scope. One man questioned his purpose. The other sensed that his life now existed on borrowed margins. That single missed round would echo far beyond the field where it was fired, because once a certainty is broken, it cannot be restored. And from that fracture, events would unfold that neither soldier could stop, events that would force them to confront the war not as enemies, but as men caught inside it. As the campaign pressed forward, the war revealed its sent persistent weapon, not artillery or rifle fire, but endurance. For both the German sniper and the American infantryman, each day layered strain upon strain. Sleep came in fragments. Silence carried suspicion. Even moments of safety were provisional, interrupted by memory and anticipation. The body adapted. The mind paid the price. The sniper's task remained unchanged on paper. Identify, calculate, eliminate. Yet repetition stripped the mission of clarity. The enemy no longer appeared as a necessary abstraction, but as a recurring presence that refused to stay distant. Each engagement accumulated weight, and with it, a quiet reckoning. He followed orders, but the sense of purpose that once justified them had begun to thin. Efficiency could not explain everything he felt. On the American side, hard experience fostered a different awareness. He had learned to think of the sniper as a threat without a face, a danger that could be managed through discipline and caution. But survival after the missed shot unsettled that simplicity. Someone had chosen not to kill him, or had failed to do so, and the distinction mattered. The idea that the man behind the rifle might struggle as he did was unsettling, but impossible to dismiss. Neither soldier spoke of these thoughts. War offered no language for them. The sniper carried guilt without confession, unsure whether it stemmed from what he had done or what he had not. The American carried vigilance shaped by uncertainty, sensing intention where once there had only been danger. Both remained effective, but their certainty had eroded. This was the struggle combat rarely records. Official histories count victories and losses, not the slow reshaping of belief. Yet in the space between shots, both men were being altered. The sniper's precision now demanded justification. The American's resilience now included reflection. They continued to move forward, but no longer with the same assumptions. Over time, these private reckonings began to converge. The war still required obedience, still demanded action, but it could no longer fully suppress recognition. The enemy, once defined solely by uniform and distance, had acquired dimension. Not enough to stop the fighting, but enough to complicate it. What neither man realized was that this internal shift was preparing them for something the battlefield itself could not resolve. Circumstances beyond their control would soon force proximity, stripping away the remaining barriers that kept enemy and self apart. And when that moment arrived, the war would confront them with a question neither rifle nor training could answer. The opportunity returned as it always did, without warning and without ceremony. Once again, the German sniper lay concealed, his position chosen with care, his rifle aligned with practiced ease. Through the scope, the American soldier appeared, familiar now in movement and posture. This was the moment the doctrine demanded. Precision had prepared him for it. The belief that defined his role pressed forward, insistent and clear. Yet the trigger remained untouched. The hesitation was brief, almost imperceptible, but it altered everything. In that pause, the sniper saw not a problem to be solved, but a life extended by choice. He adjusted the scope, then lowered the rifle. No shot followed. The American moved on, unaware that death had been measured and deliberately set aside. This was not an act of rebellion. It was quieter than that. It was the collapse of a certainty the war had built and depended upon. For the sniper, the refusal to fire fractured the identity he had relied on to endure. He was no longer merely an instrument executing distance and velocity. He had intervened in his own function. The war did not acknowledge such moments, but they lingered all the same. For the American soldier, the absence of the shot registered only as continued survival. Yet patterns are felt before they are understood. Days passed, movements repeated. The danger that had once announced itself with violence now remained strangely silent. He could not explain it, but the space he crossed no longer carried the same inevitability. Somewhere, an unseen hand had altered the terms. Both men remained where the war required them to be. The front did not soften. Orders continued. Losses mounted elsewhere. But internally, something had shifted. The sniper carried the weight of an unclaimed life, unsure whether it was guilt or relief. The American carried an undefined sense of reprieve, a question without a source. Between them, a connection formed without contact or acknowledgement. It was not friendship, not yet. It was recognition, incomplete and fragile. The battlefield still divided them, but the distance had changed. The war had taught them to reduce each other to roles. That reduction was no longer absolute. Neither man could predict where this deviation would lead. Mercy, once introduced, does not remain isolated. It reshapes context. It invites consequence. And as events beyond their control began to draw them closer, the choice not to fire would prove more decisive than any shot that had come before. By the later stages of the campaign, the war had become fluid. Front lines no longer held their earlier rigidity, and units advanced and withdrew in irregular patterns shaped by exhaustion as much as strategy. It was within this shifting landscape that the German sniper and the American infantryman found themselves drawn into the same narrowing space, not by design, but by circumstance. Combat has a way of compressing distance, forcing encounters that doctrine never anticipates. Their paths crossed not across a field of fire, but amid the confusion of movement and capture. The conditions were unremarkable by wartime standards: a disrupted position, scattered orders, a moment where resistance no longer served its purpose. When the shooting stopped, the identities of hunter and target dissolved into something less defined. Rifles were lowered, hands were visible. The war paused just long enough for recognition to occur. The irony was unmistakable. The confrontation both men had rehearsed in imagination, a final exchange, a settling of accounts, did not arrive. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the practical necessities of survival. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not alliance, simply acknowledgement. Each recognized the other as a participant in the same relentless machinery. Time stretched in ways it never had under fire. In captivity and transit, moments accumulated without violence to interrupt them. Language was limited, gestures cautious, but humanity required no translation. Shared cigarettes, a glance of understanding when artillery sounded nearby. The smallest exchanges carried weight because they were unnecessary to survival and therefore meaningful. Pressure remained constant. Guards enforced distance. The war continued to claim lives beyond the wire. Neither man forgot where he was or what the conflict demanded, yet the relentless division that had once defined every encounter began to loosen. The sniper no longer saw only a target who had escaped his aim. The American no longer imagined only a faceless threat behind a scope. Each carried the memory of the other's restraint. These moments did not erase responsibility or allegiance. They complicated them. Both men understood that survival now depended on more than vigilance or obedience. It required endurance of a different kind, the ability to carry contradiction without breaking. They spoke little of the past. They did not need to. The war had already spoken enough. Through these brief interactions, a quiet truth emerged. The enemy was not solely the man across from them, but the circumstances that had placed them there. They were soldiers shaped by orders, training, and necessity, navigating a conflict that allowed little room for choice, and yet had been altered by one. The revelation was not sudden, but cumulative. With each shared moment, the distance imposed by uniform and language narrowed. They remained on opposite sides of history, but no longer on opposite sides of humanity. What had begun as a missed shot had evolved into recognition under pressure. As the war pushed them toward its final, uncertain phases, both men carried this understanding forward. They could not know whether they would survive what remained, or what shape the world would take when the fighting ended. But they had crossed a threshold few ever do. The battlefield had failed to define them completely. And in the fragile space between combat and conversation, something irreversible had taken hold, something that would endure long after the war released its grip. The silence that had once defined their encounters was finally broken, not by command nor by necessity, but by proximity and time. After a close and unremarkable moment, shared shelter from shelling, a pause enforced by circumstance, the German sniper and the American soldier began to exchange words. They were careful at first, restrained by habit and uncertainty. Speech in war carries risk, but silence prolonged can become its own burden. What emerged was fragmented and cautious. Names were offered, not ranks. Gestures filled the spaces where language failed. The war did not recede, but it loosened its grip just enough to allow recognition. For the sniper, this was an unanticipated rupture. He had once believed his mission carried clarity, that duty, properly executed, required no reflection. That belief had sustained him through distance and detachment. Now, confronted with the voice of a man he had once reduced to coordinates, that certainty eroded. The futility of violence revealed itself not in ideology, but in detail. The sniper listened as the American spoke of home, of interruptions to ordinary life that had never fully resumed. These were not confessions, merely observations, yet they carried the war demanded outcomes, but offered no explanation for the cost. In these exchanges, the sniper recognized the same exhaustion he carried himself. For the American, the shift was equally disorienting. He had entered the war with a clear image of the enemy, shaped by necessity and reinforced by loss. Hatred had been functional. It simplified decisions and reduced hesitation. But as conversation replaced confrontation, that structure collapsed. The man across from him was not an idea. He was present, reflective, altered by the same relentless pressure. The struggle they shared was internal and ongoing. Outside, the war continued with indifference to their recognition. Reports arrived, movements resumed, casualties mounted. Inside, both men confronted a quieter reckoning. Killing, once framed as obligation, now demanded explanation. Neither offered absolution to the other. They did not attempt to resolve the conflict between them. They acknowledged it. This understanding did not arrive fully formed. It accumulated through repetition, through shared meals, through waiting, through the endurance of uncertainty. Each interaction reinforced the realization that survival alone did not constitute meaning. The war had trained them to endure physical risk. It had not prepared them for moral fatigue. Gradually, something unlikely took shape. Not alliance, not forgiveness, but familiarity. A friendship defined by restraint and context, bounded by the knowledge that it existed because the war had broken them both in similar ways. They spoke less of battles and more of what remained when the fighting ended, if it ended. The revelation was not that enemies could become friends, but that war relies on preventing such recognition. Distance, doctrine, and fear are its safeguards. Once those barriers weakened, the machinery faltered. In seeing each other fully, both men reclaimed a measure of agency the war had denied them. They could not undo what had already occurred. They could not halt the conflict that still surrounded them, but they had crossed a threshold that would shape whatever future awaited them. What began as a rivalry defined by scope and distance had transformed into understanding, shaped by proximity and time. And as the war moved toward its conclusion, that understanding would be tested, not in combat but in the uncertain peace that followed, where memory would demand to be reckoned with. The war had trained both men to think in absolutes, enemy and ally, success and failure, life and death separated by a single action. Yet by the time their paths had fully converged, those boundaries no longer held. The struggle they now faced was not tactical but moral, how to carry the knowledge of what the war had required without being defined entirely by it. In quieter moments, removed from immediate danger, they reflected on what had been taken. The sniper considered the years narrowed to discipline and distance, the precision that had preserved his life while steadily emptying it of certainty. The American weighed the cost of endurance, the constant readiness that had reshaped his sense of time and safety. Each recognized in the other a familiarity that did not depend on nationality or language. The irony was inescapable. They had been introduced through violence, bound by a moment when one had chosen not to kill the other. Everything that followed emerged from that single deviation. On opposite sides of a global conflict, they had arrived at the same questions. What had all this destruction secured? What remained when survival alone no longer justified the means? Their connection formed not through agreement, but through recognition. Shared exhaustion replaced inherited hatred. Sacrifice became a common reference point rather than a national claim. They spoke of the war not as a series of victories or defeats, but as an accumulation of moments that demanded more than they could afford to give. This understanding did not absolve either man of responsibility. They did not attempt to rewrite the past or excuse their actions. Instead, they acknowledged the limits of choice within systems designed to suppress it. The war had shaped them, but it had also revealed the possibility of refusing to let that shape become permanent. Survival, once a solitary objective, took on a different meaning. It was no longer enough to endure physically. They wanted to survive with memory intact, with the ability to name what had been lost and what had unexpectedly been found. In each other, they saw proof that the war's narrative of inevitability was incomplete. The revelation lay in contrast. That two men trained to eliminate each other could instead arrive at understanding exposed a truth the war worked to conceal. Conflict depends on distance, physical, emotional, moral. When that distance collapsed, the machinery faltered. What replaced it was fragile, provisional, and deeply human. As the conflict neared its end, uncertainty returned. In a new form. Liberation did not guarantee resolution. The future would demand separation once more, a return to nations that would interpret the war through their own frameworks. The bond formed between these former enemies would not fit easily into official histories or commemorations. Yet it endured precisely because it resisted classification. It was not reconciliation in the political sense. It was recognition at the human level, a connection forged not in victory or defeat, but in the shared burden of having lived through something that neither could forget. When they eventually parted, the war did not provide closure. It rarely does. But it left them with something unexpected, a reminder that even within systems designed to divide, individuals can still find common ground. And as the world moved on to record the war in dates and outcomes, their story remained a quiet counterpoint, waiting to be understood. As the war entered its final months, its violence did not simply fade. It contracted, intensified in places, then abruptly gave way to exhaustion. For the German sniper and the American soldier, this closing phase carried a different kind of shock. Survival was no longer the sole measure of what could be lost. Between them now existed something fragile and unplanned, a bond formed under conditions never meant to allow it. The approach of peace introduced uncertainty rather than relief. Both men understood how narrowly that connection had survived the demands of combat. The war had trained them to expect endings shaped by force. This one offered no such clarity. Instead, it required reflection. They revisited their experiences not as enemies, but as witnesses to the same destruction. In doing so, they arrived at a shared belief that the conflict had asked too much of too many and explained too little in return. The irony was unavoidable. Their rivalry, once defined by a rifle's scope and a narrow strip of ground, had dissolved without a final exchange. There was no decisive moment to mark its end, no victory claimed by one over the other. What remained was an understanding of futility, that their confrontation, like so many others, had served a machinery indifferent to individual lives. When the fighting finally ceased, the world did not pause to absorb its meaning. Armies reorganized, borders shifted, men were processed, released, sent home. Within this movement, the two soldiers faced a turning point that had nothing to do with strategy. They could choose what to carry forward. The war had shaped them through discipline and deprivation, but it had also exposed their capacity for recognition. Their separation was inevitable. Nations reclaimed their citizens. Languages and customs reasserted themselves. Yet the friendship forged between them did not dissolve with distance. It persisted in memory, in correspondence, in the quiet acknowledgement that someone else had seen the same war from the opposite side and arrived at the same conclusions. This was not reconciliation in the political sense. It did not erase responsibility or grief. It was something more modest and more durable, a commitment to remember the war as it was lived, not as it would later be simplified. In each other, they had found proof that humanity could endure even where systems failed. The revelation at the heart of their story is not that enemies can become friends. It is that war depends on preventing such outcomes. Distance, abstraction, and fear sustain conflict. When those barriers fall, the logic of destruction weakens. Their bond, formed in the margins of history, stands as evidence of that vulnerability. As the years passed, the war receded into records and ceremonies. For most, it became a sequence of dates and outcomes. For these two men, it remained personal and unresolved, yet it also offered a measure of clarity. They had survived not only the fighting, but the narrowing of vision that war demands. What began as a mission to kill ended as a lesson in restraint. What began as a rivalry ended in empathy. Their story does not alter the course of the war, but it complicates its meaning. And in that complication lies its quiet power, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest conflicts, understanding can still emerge, unexpected and enduring. The war ended abruptly, but its departure did not bring resolution. For both men, the transition from soldier to civilian proved more complex than any battlefield maneuver. Uniforms were exchanged for ordinary clothing, weapons for tools of work, yet the habits of vigilance endured. Crowded streets replaced front lines, but the mind remained attuned to threat, to memory, to loss. Peace required a different discipline, one neither had been trained for. Each returned to a homeland reshaped by absence. Families welcomed them back with relief that carried its own distance. Words failed to bridge what had been experienced and what could be understood. The war had not followed them home in visible form, but it lived on in disrupted sleep, in sudden silences, in moments when the past pressed unexpectedly into the present. They carried these burdens separately, yet not entirely alone. The irony of their friendship became clearer with time. It had been formed in an environment designed to extinguish empathy, yet it endured where many wartime bonds did not. Letters crossed borders that had once been fortified. Recollections were shared without justification or defense. In these exchanges, neither man sought absolution. They sought continuity, a way to integrate what they had lived through into lives that now demanded normalcy. Their bond served as a quiet counterargument to the war's legacy. It did not deny suffering or minimize responsibility. Instead, it affirmed that healing was possible without forgetting. Each man recognized in the other a witness who required no explanation. They had seen the same fear from opposite directions. They had survived the same narrowing of choice. This recognition marked a turning point. The friendship, once improbable, became intentional. It was no longer sustained by circumstance, but by decision. In choosing to remain connected, they asserted agency over a past that had denied it. Their shared history, rather than isolating them, provided structure. It allowed them to confront memory without being overwhelmed by it. In a broader sense, their relationship reflected a possibility larger than themselves. Post-war societies struggled to reconcile devastation with renewal. Narratives of victory and defeat dominated public memory, often leaving little space for complexity. Their friendship occupied that space. It suggested that reconciliation did not require agreement on history, only acknowledgement of humanity. The emotional and psychological scars of war remained. Neither man claimed otherwise. There were losses that could not be restored, choices that could not be undone. But within their friendship, those scars found context. They were not marks of failure, but evidence of endurance. The war had taken much from them, yet it had not stripped away the capacity for understanding. Over time, their story became less about what had happened between them during the war and more about what continued afterward. It was sustained through years marked by change, by aging, by the gradual distance from events that once defined every moment. The friendship adapted as they did, shaped by memory but not confined to it. What had been forged under fire proved resilient in peace. It did not demand recognition or validation. It existed quietly, a testament to the idea that even in the most destructive circumstances, individuals can choose to see beyond imposed divisions. Their lives did not become symbols by intention. Yet in enduring together, they offered something rare, a reminder that the end of war is not found solely in treaties or surrender documents, but in the long, deliberate work of understanding. And in that work begun by two men who once faced each other through a rifle's scope, the possibility of healing continued, unresolved, imperfect, but real. The end of the war did not bring silence so much as noise of a different kind. Cities rebuilt themselves amid rubble. Nations redefined borders and identities. For the German sniper and the American soldier, the shock lay not in what ended, but in what continued. Against every expectation shaped by years of violence, their friendship endured. What had begun under fire now moved forward into a world struggling to remember how peace was meant to feel. This persistence carried its own weight. Neither man could easily explain the bond to others, nor did they try. It did not fit the language of victory or defeat. Yet through letters, visits, and shared reflection, they maintained a connection that had outlived the circumstances that created it. In doing so, they confronted an irony neither could have imagined during the war, that a relationship born from restraint and hesitation would become a source of stability in its aftermath. The story they carried between them had once been defined by violence, by a shot that could have been fired and was not. Now it was shaped by forgiveness, though neither used the word lightly. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it erase responsibility. It meant acknowledging harm without allowing it to dictate the future. Understanding, hard-earned and incomplete, replaced the certainty that war had imposed. Far from the battlefield, reflection took on a different character. Without the immediacy of survival, memory expanded. Both men revisited the moments that had altered their paths, the hesitation, the encounter, the gradual recognition of shared humanity. Distance revealed what proximity had obscured, that their friendship was not an anomaly, but a possibility the war had worked tirelessly to suppress. This realization marked a turning point. They understood that their bond was not sustained by coincidence alone, but by a mutual willingness to confront the past honestly. The hatred they had been taught was effective, but shallow. What endured was something quieter and more demanding, empathy shaped by shared loss. In choosing to maintain their connection, they rejected the simplest narratives of the war without denying its reality. Their conversations no longer centered on battles or tactics. They spoke of families, of work, of the challenge of belonging again to societies that preferred simplified histories. In each other, they found a rare space where complexity was permitted. The war had stripped them of illusion. Peace, they discovered, required patience. The revelation at the heart of their story lies in its ordinariness. There was no grand reconciliation ceremony, no public recognition. Healing occurred incrementally, through continued choice. Their friendship demonstrated that empathy does not require agreement, only attention. That understanding can emerge even where hatred was once necessary for survival. In a century marked by unprecedented destruction, their bond stands as a quiet counterpoint. It does not redeem the war or justify its cost. It merely asserts that within even the most dehumanizing systems, individuals retain the capacity to recognize one another. This recognition does not undo suffering, but it prevents suffering from becoming the final word. As time passed, the war receded into history, but its lessons did not fade. For these two men, healing was not a destination reached, but a path continually chosen. Their story reminds us that empathy is not the absence of conflict, but the refusal to let conflict erase humanity. What began as a moment of mercy became a lifelong reckoning. And in that reckoning, they found something the war could never provide: proof that understanding, once allowed to take root, can survive even the deepest divisions. When the war finally settled into history, it left behind more than altered borders and military records. It left lives permanently reshaped by decisions made under pressure, fear, and obedience. The story of the German sniper and the American soldier endures because it exposes that cost with uncommon clarity. It reminds us that war's true price is not paid only in the moment of violence, but in the years spent carrying its memory. Their friendship, improbable and unplanned, became a living consequence of the conflict they survived. It did not emerge in defiance of the war's realities, but because of them. Each man understood what the other had been required to do. They recognized that survival in war often demands actions that resist simple judgment. Forgiveness, in this context, was not absolution. It was acknowledgement, an acceptance that humanity persists even when circumstances attempt to erase it. The irony of their bond is unavoidable. They were trained to negate each other's existence, yet what ultimately defined them was restraint rather than violence. The war rewarded efficiency and obedience, but it was mercy that reshaped their lives. In a system designed to harden men into instruments, their refusal to fully surrender empathy became an act of quiet defiance. This does not diminish the harm done or the lives lost elsewhere. Their story does not redeem the war or soften its brutality. Instead, it sharpens our understanding of it. Violence was effective, but it was not enduring. What lasted was the moral weight of choice, the knowledge that even within constrained circumstances, decisions mattered. Over time, their shared experiences took on the shape of lessons rather than wounds. They learned that hatred, though efficient, is fragile. It depends on distance and ignorance. Once those collapse, it cannot sustain itself. Forgiveness, by contrast, is demanding. It requires memory, patience, and the willingness to remain present with discomfort. It is not instinctive, it is chosen. Their bond proved stronger than the roles they once occupied. Soldier and sniper gave way to men shaped by history rather than defined by it. In remembering the war together, they resisted the simplifications that often follow conflict. They preserved complexity in a world eager for clarity. This, too, is a form of legacy. The revelation embedded in their story is not dramatic. It is steady and enduring. Wars end. Lessons do not. What they learned through each other, that empathy can survive ideology, that recognition can outlast hatred, became part of how they understood the world long after the fighting stopped. These lessons did not erase grief, but they gave it meaning. History often remembers wars through scale. Divisions moved, cities destroyed, treaties signed. Stories like this operate at a different resolution. They reveal how individuals navigate systems far larger than themselves and how meaning is reclaimed in small, deliberate ways. The power of forgiveness lies not in spectacle, but in persistence. As years passed and their generation, the urgency of the war faded from public consciousness. But for those who had lived it, the questions remained. What had been necessary? What had been lost? What, if anything, had been saved? In their friendship, the answer was partial but profound. The war took much from them. It did not take everything. And in that remaining space where understanding replaced enmity, their story continues to speak. Quietly, enduringly. Not as a denial of war's cruelty, but as evidence that even within it, humanity can still be chosen. Long after the war's noise had faded, what remained for both men was silence of a different kind. Not the tense stillness of a battlefield, but the quiet that follows survival. In that space, reflection replaced reaction. The German sniper and the American soldier, once defined by action, now carried the weight of what those actions had required. The war had ended, but its imprint had not. They reflected often on the roles they had played. Each understood how easily those roles had consumed identity. Training, orders, and necessity had narrowed their choices until survival became the only language left. The scars that followed were not always visible. They surfaced in memory, in hesitation, in the lingering awareness that violence, once normalized, does not entirely release its hold. Yet alongside these scars existed an unexpected peace. It did not arrive through victory or vindication, but through recognition. In each other, they had found a witness who did not require explanation. Their shared history allowed them to speak without rehearsal and listen without judgment. This mutual understanding did not erase the past, but it made living with it possible. The irony of their journey revealed itself gradually. They had mastered the tools of war, rifles, tactics, concealment, yet it was none of these that shaped their lasting legacy. What endured was something quieter and more fragile. Compassion, extended in a moment of hesitation, had altered the course of their lives more decisively than any weapon ever could. This realization reframed how they understood strength. War had taught them that power lay in domination and efficiency. Peace suggested otherwise. The ability to see the enemy as human required a different kind of resolve. It demanded vulnerability where certainty had once sufficed. In choosing understanding over resentment, they reclaimed agency the war had denied them. Their friendship did not seek attention. It unfolded privately, sustained by continued choice rather than circumstance. In a world eager to categorize the war in clear terms, their bond resisted easy interpretation. It was not a statement. It was a practice, a commitment to remember without being consumed. Through their story, the human element of conflict comes into focus. Wars are fought by individuals whose inner lives rarely appear in official accounts. The German sniper and the American soldier represent countless others who carried similar burdens in isolation. Their connection illuminates a path rarely acknowledged, the possibility that healing can occur not in spite of war, but in response to its cost. The revelation their friendship offers is modest but enduring. Understanding does not require agreement. Compassion does not negate accountability. Healing does not demand forgetting. These truths, learned slowly and lived deliberately, shaped the remainder of their lives. As time passed, the war became history. Its participants grew older. The urgency that once defined every moment gave way to reflection, yet the lessons they had learned remained present. They had been soldiers in a conflict defined by division. They became something else afterward, custodians of a quieter truth. They did not change the world. They did not end the war. But in choosing to see each other fully, they demonstrated what remains possible even after profound destruction. In the end, they were remembered not for the shots they fired or the battles they survived, but for the silence they shared, a silence that held understanding, compassion, and the enduring echo of shared humanity. What began as a rivalry defined by distance and intent had over time been reshaped into something the war itself could never produce. The German sniper and the American soldier entered history as adversaries, each assigned a role that demanded the other's destruction. Yet in surviving the war, and in refusing to let it be the final authority over their lives, they arrived at an outcome neither doctrine nor probability could predict. The peace they found was not sudden. It was assembled gradually, through years marked by memory and restraint. They carried with them the full weight of what they had seen and done. There was no attempt to soften the past or diminish its cost. Instead, they allowed it to exist honestly between them. In that honesty, rivalry lost its hold. Friendship, once inconceivable, became durable. Their bond did not erase difference. Language, culture, and history still separated them. But empathy proved stronger than division. They had both lived within the same moral tension, the knowledge that survival had required actions they would carry forever. In recognizing this shared burden, they found relief not in explanation, but in understanding. The moral closure of their story lies not in redemption, but in resolution. They did not undo the war. They did not claim that compassion could outweigh its destruction. What they demonstrated was more restrained and more powerful, that individuals can choose how the war continues within them. Hatred had once been necessary. It was no longer inevitable. Their friendship stood as quiet evidence that peace is not merely the absence of fighting. It is the presence of reflection. The war had taught them efficiency, discipline, and obedience. Life afterward demanded something else, the courage to remain human in the face of memory. Together, they learned that courage could be shared. In a world eager for simplified lessons, their story resists summary. It does not suggest that war is misunderstood or that its outcomes can be easily reconciled. It suggests only that empathy can survive where certainty fails. That recognition can emerge even from the most rigid divisions. Their lives unfolded beyond the frame of history books. They aged. They watched new generations inherit a world shaped by conflicts they had known firsthand. Through it all, their bond remained a private testament to what had been endured and what had been refused. They had been shaped by the war, but they were not defined solely by it. The reflection their friendship invites is not abstract. It asks what becomes possible when enemies are no longer reduced to function or uniform. When the distance required for violence collapses, something else takes its place. Responsibility does not disappear, memory does not fade, but meaning can change. In the end, their story closes not with triumph, but with peace of a quieter kind. A peace found not in victory, but in mutual recognition. What began as a mission to kill became a lifelong reminder of restraint. What began as fear ended in trust. History will continue to record wars through outcomes and statistics. Stories like this endure differently. They persist because they challenge inevitability. They remind us that even within humanity's most destructive moments, the capacity for understanding remains. And so their journey resolves not on a battlefield, but in memory, shared, acknowledged, and carried forward. In war, they were enemies. In peace, they were brothers.